The Subcommittee on Oversight and Intelligence will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to review waste, fraud, and abuse in U.S. foreign assistance and to examine how ineffectively internal controls and oversight mechanisms have enabled bad actors to profit. I also just want to advise members and witnesses that votes are expected at 3 p.m. this afternoon. When votes are called, we will temporarily adjourn this hearing, should it not be already over, to allow members to participate, and we will reconvene immediately thereafter. I appreciate everyone's flexibility and cooperations in advance. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good afternoon and welcome to today's Oversight and Intelligence Subcommittee hearing entitled Waste, Fraud, and Abuse in Foreign Assistance: Lessons Learned and Charting a Path Forward. I'd like to thank our distinguished witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today and for supporting our efforts to safeguard U.S. taxpayers' dollars to expose waste, fraud, and abuse and hold accountable those who have been exploiting U.S. generosity. As a nation, we should be embarrassed that funding for foreign assistance has too often strengthened America's adversaries, the same adversaries who have oppressed and terrorized the populations we sought to help. Whether through a local NGO, a large for-profit entity, or a public international organization, opportunistic bad actors have for years exploited pervasive weaknesses in the system of foreign assistance that we created. From my own time in Afghanistan, I witnessed firsthand how contracts profited enormously with little to show for it. Between 2005 and 2017, $259 million was spent on a road project that was never even completed. After 12 years, only about 15% of the road was built, and even those sections that were completed quickly deteriorated. Contractors benefited from lack of oversight and took U.S. taxpayer dollars without completing the projects. In 2025, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, estimated that as little as 30 to 40% of donor funds actually reached the intended population after the Taliban's and other fees, bribes, and extortion. Terrorists have extorted and enriched themselves through international aid around the world. For years, Al-Shabaab, a designated terrorist organization, extorted millions of dollars annually through collecting taxes, establishing roadblocks to UN aid. In the early 1990s, Somalian warlords deliberately starved their own people to encourage international aid, and in line basically pied their own pockets. For decades, inspector generals and auditors have sounded the alarm to systemic oversight and accountability failures that have enabled waste, fraud, and abuse in foreign assistance, from the lack of internal controls in the early stages of awarding a grant or contract, to the opaque layers of the subcontracting that follows. The bad actors at every single level have profited from U.S. foreign assistance. In June of last year, a contracting officer for the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, received an estimated $1 million in bribes to repeatedly manipulate the procurement process, approve awards, and deceive USAID decision-makers in favor of 2 awardees. 3 owners and presidents of their respective companies also pleaded guilty for a decade-long bribery and fraud scheme that involved over $550 million in prime contracts. Last year, the president took a very important step to end these wasteful and corruptive practices. With USAID's failures now behind us, we have an opportunity to chart a new path forward, a path that safeguards U.S. funds and that does not enrich our enemies. A path that does not measure effectiveness by dollars spent, but by real outcome that doesn't just benefit the intended recipients, but also clearly make the United States safer, stronger, and more prosperous. Reform in foreign assistance has been long overdue, and with that, I look forward to hearing how we can chart this new path together. With that, I will now recognize my ranking member, Representative Moskowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity. Good afternoon. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today's hearing on fraud, waste, and abuse in foreign assistance. Obviously, I think it's fair to say that there is fraud, waste, and abuse in our federal government. In fact, it would be crazy to not think that in a $7 trillion budget that there wouldn't be some fraud, waste, and abuse. And obviously, that would also apply to foreign assistance. And when you have a government spending $7 trillion, it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be errors in our system. However, in order to root out actual fraud, waste, and abuse and make our government programs more effective, I think it's important that we all operate on the same basic definitions. Luckily for us, Ms. Lovegrayer's agency has definitions for all 3. And as a reminder, the Government Accountability Office whole purpose is to analyze how taxpayer dollars are spent and to provide Congress and others with fact-based information that can help the agency save money and work more efficiently. So from the GAO, fraud involves obtaining something of value through willful misrepresentation. Waste occurs when individuals or organizations expend government resources carelessly, extravagantly, or without adequate purpose. I think we're going to find out that Corey Lewandowski did a lot of that at DHS. Abuse occurs when someone behaves improperly, unreasonably, or misuses a position or authority. I think, again, we'll find out some more about DHS. My concern is that fraud, waste, and abuse lately is becoming a cover for programs I don't like. Just because I don't like a program, if I say there's some fraud, waste, and abuse, I can try to get rid of a program. And maybe there are people out there that think programs that feed starving children should go away, or providing basic maternal care, or eliminating deadly diseases, or stopping human trafficking. If they believe those programs should go away, they should vote for that. They shouldn't just claim there's fraud, waste, and abuse. They should go on the record. I also think it's interesting that we're talking about fraud, waste, and abuse in an administration that both in the second term and the first term has added trillions of dollars to the deficit. And so, look, I can disagree with you. I can believe that these programs help stabilize fragile regions, that support our partners to advance democratic values and provide strategic advantages for the United States, also why lifting people out of disease and poverty. I can argue that when we pull back our soft power, adversarial nations like China are all too happy to fill the void we've left. Just look at the fact that when we rapidly stood up China rapidly stood up identical programs that we pulled out of last year. And I just don't think you can have it both ways. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I agree with them on this, are worried about Chinese influence around the world. But at the same time, if you're worried about that, then you can't withdraw from the international community knowing full well China will fill that void. And so because of these precarious zones in which a lot of foreign assistance is delivered, conflict areas, weak governance regions, we must have an even more rigorous and informed oversight. That's why what hearings like this are designed to do, and that brings to a point that I believe deserves acknowledgement today. If the administration really believed that waste, fraud, and abuse in foreign assistance were serious enough to justify dismantling major foreign assistance agencies, then these oversight hearings should have happened first. And they should have happened a long time ago. We should have examined the evidence, heard from the experts, evaluated the oversight mechanisms, and considered reforms. That's how legislative process is supposed to work. Oversight should precede major structural decisions, not follow them. But we all know that's not what happened. In fact, we watched DOJ actually sideline Congress. They even sidelined the DOJ caucus. Okay, there was a caucus created in Congress to look at government efficiency, and Elon Musk and DOJ never even brought them into the fold. Congress was completely cut out. They canceled programs across government claiming fraud, waste, and abuse, and they left the Department of State scrambling. In fact, Trump's administration had to undo some of the things that DOJ wound up doing. They never got to the efficiency part. DOJ never did anything that created more efficiency for the government. And then the Foreign Affairs Committee got one closed roundtable with then Deputy Administrator of USAID, Peter Marocco. It lasted 45 minutes, and he didn't have a lot of the answers. That's not what legislative oversight is. So eliminating institutions doesn't automatically eliminate waste. In fact, after USAID was closed, food purchased with American taxpayer dollars was allowed to sit and spoil, and then more American tax dollars had to be spent to incinerate the hundreds of metric tons of food. To me, that sounds like the GAO definition of what waste, which we reviewed earlier. It's our goal to reduce fraud, waste, and abuse. And the answer is not simply to dismantle institutions and to eliminate programs just because you don't like them. The answer is to strengthen oversight, improve transparency, modernize monitoring tools, and ensure Congress receives clear and timely information. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to ensure that our oversight responsibilities are met. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much to the ranking member. While I agree that we didn't get necessarily to the efficiency piece, that's why the investigation such as this is so important, but I would say the elimination of certain programs and projects, for example, like you saw in the Veteran Administration's building, where they were having a $50,000 to $70,000 per year contract to water 5 plants. I think that's something that we can look at as a waste, fraud, and abuse area. I'll also note that we don't always have to throw hundreds of millions of dollars at nations in order to build strong relationships. I just came back from Honduras yesterday, where I met with the new president as well as for the head of the Congress, and I can tell you that they are very much in line with trying to get rid of China and the corruptive practices that are going on there, to get rid of communism, which is a long-fought goal of not just the Conservative Party, but the Liberal Party. And all it took, and this was coming directly from the president and from the head of Congress, said what really got us over the edge was when President Trump had tweeted out and asked to have a free and fair election and showed support for this administration. So sometimes the thing that people hate so much, a simple tweet, can be very effective. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. This committee recognizes the importance of the issues before us. Our two witnesses today include Mr. Adam Kaplan, the Associate Deputy Inspector General for the Office of the Inspector General at the U.S. Agency for International Development, who has been at the forefront of holding organizations accountable for terrorist, diversion, fraud, and corruption. Ms. Letitia Love-Grayer is the Director of International Affairs and Trade at the Government of Accountability Offices. Ms. Love-Grayer has over 23 years of experience leading performance and forensic audits, leading to millions of dollars in savings across federal programs where U.S. taxpayer dollars were at risk of waste, fraud, and abuse. This committee recognizes the importance of the issue before us and is grateful to have you both here to speak with us today. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask you to keep your opening remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow members to have enough time for questioning. With that, I'll now recognize Mr. Kaplan for your opening statements.
Thank you. Chairman Mills, Ranking Member Moskowitz, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Nobody has a track record like the USAID IG in fighting fraud and corruption in foreign assistance. As the only IG dedicated solely to overseeing foreign assistance programs run by multiple agencies, we know the people, places, and schemes that put taxpayer dollars at risk. USAID had a dedicated staff and solid mechanisms to manage risks to its programs. As the IG, we naturally found shortcomings. Today, I'll summarize 3 such challenges identified in my written testimony applicable to any agency administering foreign assistance. Challenge 1, ensuring transparent access to information. USAID heavily relied on award recipients operating in remote locations to self-disclose fraud allegations. Of all award recipients, the least transparent is the United Nations. We encounter nonstop obstruction by the UN to share information about potential misuse of US funds. To illustrate, we've sought information from 5 different UN agencies on 10 investigations. Response times ranged from 6 months to 2 years. This is unacceptable. We urge the State Department to implement a clause mandating that awards to the UN provide us with access to information. Challenge 2, ensuring that award terms prioritize accountability. USAID had hundreds of regulations designed to address risks to programs. However, there were shortcomings. For example, USAID declined to include a forum selection clause in agreements with foreign-based NGOs. There's no reason why a Florida-based aid organization can be sued for fraud in U.S. court, while one based in London can't. But cases have been dismissed because USAID omitted this clause. Further, USAID's anti-terrorism certifications applied only to grants, not contracts. This certification allowed the Department of Justice and OIG to bring cases against grantees for concealing past support to Iran and Hezbollah. Inexplicably, however, contractors were not required to make the same representation. Also, USAID's required partner vetting of aid organization staff designed to ensure that terrorists don't get our money exempted UN staff. To address this gap, USAID IG is investigating UN staff for ties to Hamas to ensure US taxpayers don't pay their salaries. Challenge 3, ensuring effective monitoring and staffing. Mitigating risks requires more than announcing costly monitoring contracts. For example, USAID missed opportunities to improve programs in Somalia because it lacked a system for managing recommendations from its monitors. In Ukraine, contractors USAID hired to oversee its $26 billion in direct budget support failed to provide required reports on time or at all. Moving forward, the government must ensure monitors provide timely information and that officials leverage monitor findings to ensure program objectives are being met. To further mitigate risk, the government must adequately staff awards and monitor sub-awardees. Our audit found in Ethiopia, USAID employed too few people to manage awards and ultimately failed to detect a massive food diversion scandal. The path forward requires an appropriate ratio of staff to awards given the money at stake. Lastly, despite fraud often occurring at the sub-award level, there's no internal database of sub-awardees, despite their outsized role in programs and involvement in fraud schemes. Finally, combating overseas fraud requires an IG that is willing to follow the money, ask difficult questions, and hold perpetrators accountable. Rather than playing Monday morning quarterback, USAID IG's experience places us in the pregame huddle, allowing us to inform Congress and agencies of risks before billions of dollars of programming goes out, not years later. Our unique authority to employ Foreign Service officers also allows us to routinely visit project sites in remote and dangerous locations. In doing so, we've uncovered roads that were reported as complete but were never built. We found edible grain meant for starving kids being replaced with animal feed. In distribution sites where food reported as delivered never arrived. Without USAID IG on the ground, those losses would remain hidden and the schemes would continue. And critically, we work to protect and empower confidential sources who face real risks for coming forward to report fraud, diversion, and sexual exploitation and abuse. The American people deserve confidence that their taxpayer dollars are protected, and the communities who rely on U.S. assistance deserve assurance that the support intended them is not lost to fraud, corruption, or abuse. I thank the committee for its continued support for USAID IG's unique brand of oversight and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kaplan. I now recognize Ms. Love-Greer for an opening statement.
Chairman Mills, Ranking Member Moskowitz, and members of the subcommittee. Can you hear me now? Chairman Mills, Ranking Member Moskowitz, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss GAO's work examining federal efforts to manage the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse in foreign assistance. U.S. foreign assistance plays an important role in advancing U.S. foreign policy goals. It supports countries that are strategic to U.S. security and economic interest, countries experiencing conflict, and vulnerable populations around the world. In fiscal year 2026, Congress appropriated roughly $50 billion for the Department of State and other foreign affairs programs. For many years, much of this assistance was administered by the U.S. Agency for International Development. However, following changes in 2025, the U.S. Department of State is now the federal government's primary provider of foreign assistance. This time of transition calls for a focus on fraud risk management. Foreign assistance is often delivered in complex environments, marked by conflict, instability, and humanitarian crisis, conditions that can heighten the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. Although most federal spending is not lost to fraud, every diverted dollar weakens programs, wastes taxpayers' dollars, and undermines public trust. Because fraud is costly and difficult to detect, prosecute, and recover, prevention is the most effective way to protect taxpayer dollars and ensure program integrity. Our work has identified several factors that make foreign assistance particularly vulnerable. First, assistance is often delivered through implementing partners, such as contractors, nonprofits, and international organizations. These partners may also fund sub-partners. If controls are weak anywhere in that chain, the risk of fraud increases. Second, many programs operate in conflict zones where violence and instability may limit in-person oversight by agencies and partners, making it hard to verify how funds were actually used. Third, humanitarian crises often require rapid delivery of aid. When agencies must move funding quickly to address emergencies, maintaining strong controls can be more challenging. Finally, agencies have a desire to work directly with local organizations to deliver assistance. This approach can improve long-term sustainability, but some local partners may have limited experience managing federal awards or maintaining strong financial controls. GAO's work has identified real examples of fraud, waste, and abuse in foreign assistance. For instance, our recent review of the U.S. African Development Foundation identified significant fraud risk management weaknesses as well as highly questionable procurement practices that we reported were red flags for potential fraud schemes. The Director of Financial Management later pled guilty to contract-related offenses. In another example, our 2023 review of fraud risk management in conflict zones described widespread diversion of food aid in Somalia. And in Afghanistan, GAO reported multiple instances of fraud and waste tied to reconstruction programs. These examples demonstrate why strong fraud risk management is essential. Agencies have taken some positive steps. They conduct certain risk assessments, review some partners' past performance, require reporting of suspected violations to inspector generals, and sometimes use third-party monitoring to access hard-to-reach locations. However, our work has identified significant weaknesses. For example, some agencies like State and USAID did not conduct program-specific fraud risk assessments, leaving them vulnerable to predictable risks. Fraud awareness training was not required, limiting officials' awareness of how to prevent, detect, or respond to potential fraud. Oversight of subpartners was inconsistent or wholly lacking. Third-party monitoring often focused on performance management and was not designed for fraud risk detection. And agencies did not always use available data analytics to identify unusual spending patterns that can be indications of fraud or abuse. From July 2016 through September 2025, GAO has made more than 50 recommendations to improve fraud risk management in foreign assistance. As early as 2026, agencies had implemented only 22 of those recommendations, while 29 remain unimplemented. Addressing our recommendations will be particularly important as foreign assistance programs are restructured and the State Department assumes a larger role in administering them. Congress can also help strengthen oversight by reinstating certain requirements for agencies to regularly report on their anti-fraud and risk management activities. By strengthening controls, learning from past risks, and implementing GAO and OIG recommendations, agencies can better protect taxpayer dollars and ensure that foreign assistance achieves its intended purpose. Chairman Mills, Ranking Member Moskowitz, members of the subcommittee, this concludes my oral statement. Be happy to take questions at this time.
Thank you, Ms. Love-Greer. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. USAID attempted to develop a number of oversight mechanisms to improve program effectiveness and safeguard U.S. funds over the years. Yet foreign assistance has remained susceptible to waste, fraud, and abuse. Regardless of the type of implementer, bad actors have profited from U.S. generosity abroad. Whether they are contractors committing fraud or terroristic diverting aid, a multitude of systemic weaknesses have enabled bad actors to commit waste, fraud, and abuse. How have you seen bad actors exploit gaps in the U.S. oversight? I'll start with you, Mr. Kaplan.
Thanks for your question. They certainly have tried to exploit gaps, and some of them are exactly what I just identified in my opening testimony, and they're examples. I mean, and sometimes they're very slight examples, and they go back to the actual clauses that either exist or don't exist. So, for example, the forum selection clause I mentioned, we actually had a great case in the Southern District of New York where a British NGO had falsified its past support provided to Hezbollah and Iranian affiliates. They had to declare it in their certification. They made the false representation. We had them dead to right. Brought the case. The judge in New York said, well, there's really no ties to, it's a British firm, and other than the actual contract grant, there's no ties to the United States. They don't have an office in the US. It's a personal jurisdiction issue. Case dismissed. You have no idea how much that frustrated us because it was a great case, and this contractor lied about his past representation with affiliation with terrorist actors. The judge said, had USAID simply put in a forum selection clause where the grant recipient would have said, okay, by virtue of us accepting millions of dollars in aid, we accept the risk that we could be brought in US court for a fraud suit. They should accept the risk. They accept our money. The same goes for the United Nations. The United Nations puts up every excuse in the book as to why they cannot comply with our information requests. Every excuse in the book. They're a grant recipient. The problem is the accountability mechanisms are limited when it comes to the United Nations. We have more access and more enforceability over, there's criminal consequences, civil consequences for contractors in NGO. With the UN, the enforcement mechanisms are much more limited. However, there's still things that USAID and the State Department can and State Department should be doing, and that's enforcing vetting. There's no reason, again, why NGO staff and contractor staff operating in high-risk environments controlled by terrorist actors had to put their folks through US government vetting systems. The UN was exempt. Why? Are we to trust the UN's own vetting procedures given what happened with UNRWA and the mass infiltration of UN staff that also are Hamas affiliates or participated in the October 7th terrorist attacks? There's no reason why UN staff should escape the same level of vetting and scrutiny as NGOs and contractors. No reason at all. Forum selection clause, access to information. There's 3 buckets of recipients, contractors.
I just want to get to a couple more questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Thanks.
If you wrap up, please.
Yep. No, I think I've said my piece on this. Go ahead.
All right. And to your point, I wanted to point these out because I know you're aware of them. You know, examples of waste, fraud, and abuse that we have. For example, the $550 million bribery scheme, a USAID contracting officer and 3 executives pled guilty to. Improperly vetted contractors, to your point about vetting, for $800 million in USAID contracts. Last year was uncovered USA awarded for a joint venture to receive up to $800 million to address irregular migration of Central America to the United States and climate change. Even after that, the substantial evidence that is the partner company Visitant was involved in that bribery scheme. Debarment of former UNRWA employees for participation, to your point. Former USAID subawardee employees debarred for 5 years for embezzling U.S. global health funds, for falsifying documents, and also the director of USAID projects arrested for a 9-year fraud scheme that resulted in over $240,000 to his pocket. So with the time that I have remaining at this point, I want to talk with GAO for a minute. And this is kind of important for me. In your testimony, you identified systemic weaknesses in agencies' efforts to prevent, detect, and properly respond to fraud, risk, and foreign assistance, or made recommendations for these weaknesses. Many of these recommendations have not been implemented. Was USAID not effectively managing fraud risks and implementing internal controls systemically?
We did identify weaknesses in USAID's efforts to do so. You mentioned some of them. The screening and of implementing partners and sub-partners was limited. Here's another area we haven't talked about yet. When we are working with partners who we know have committed fraud, waste, or abuse, or been suspended or debarred, that information is often not making it back into the federal procurement databases that are used to screen them for future awards. So we can have a cycle of working with the same actors who we know have had a history of violating our rules, our regulations, and fraud, waste, and abuse being among them. So that's one of the internal control weaknesses we identified. There's others that relate to monitoring, especially in conflict zones where we can't go ourselves. For example, we're not using third-party monitors effectively, and we have been recommending for over 10 years that third-party monitors be trained on fraud awareness, and it be built into their contract that they look for fraud and report on detecting fraud. That is still inconsistently happening.
And so you both believe that members or companies or for-profit entities or implementing partners who have been accused and found guilty of waste, fraud, and abuse should be disbarred from being able to go for future contracts, correct?
They should be debarred whether or not they're found guilty or convicted. Sometimes it's very hard because of the jurisdictional issues, but at very least they should be debarred. And USAID has been exceptionally aggressive in referring implementers for debarment.
And Ms. Love-Grayer, just yes or no on your feelings of that as well?
Yeah, depending on the case, absolutely. We should not be working with actors who have a repeated history of fraud, waste, and abuse.
Thank you so much. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Moskowitz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kaplan, you spoke about issues and accountability at the UN and mentioned that we should tighten mandatory disclosure requirements and add clear consequences for failure to comply. Can you provide some more details on what you think that should look like, and would you recommend additional auditing and transparency tools?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. It's just a constant source of frustration. It should frustrate every single American taxpayer where money is going to the United Nations, where money continues to go to UN agencies. Again, they're a one bucket of recipient. You have UN agencies, NGOs, and contractors. When it comes to the UN, we have the least enforcement remedies available. We have the least access and the least transparency in that. So I think there's absolutely means to tighten up. In the 2024 Appropriations Act, there's a specific clause, Section 7048, if you're keeping score at home, that requires the Secretary of State to seek to implement in all agreements with the UN access for the USAID IG, State IG, and GAO. That is essential, and failure to comply with that should either result in not receiving an award or reward remedies for noncompliance.
All right, well, I appreciate that, and I agree. I want to go with this logic for a second that because there was waste, fraud, and abuse in USAID, we should get rid of it, right? Which, that was the argument. I assume you would agree that in a $7 trillion budget, we could probably find, in fact, we have found waste, fraud, and abuse in every department, right?
That's why you have inspectors general to root it out.
That's right. So there's waste, fraud, and abuse in the Pentagon, right?
Correct.
And there's waste, fraud, and abuse in DHS.
Yes.
In fact, we just saw the other day $200 million, right, to be spent on advertising, right? That sounds like a waste to me. I mean, it was more money that was spent on the last Jurassic Park movie or one of the Lord of the Rings movies or one of the Harry Potter movies. I think the Barbie movie was less expensive. In fact, I think every movie except one that was nominated for an Oscar was less expensive than what Kristi Noem spent. To spend $200 million, Kristi Noem, and not get nominated by an Oscar, I think shows their liberal bias. So there's definitely waste, right? But no one's talking about getting rid of those places. No one's talking about, just because we're spending, $9 million on crab legs in the Pentagon or $220 million on furniture in the Pentagon or, $100,000 on a Steinway piano in the Pentagon. No one's talking about getting rid of the Pentagon just because there's waste, fraud, and abuse, right? That would be unreasonable, Mr. Kaplan. You agree?
No one's talking about getting rid of those agencies.
Right, of course, right? So it would be, and that's where the disconnect is here, is that somehow because this agency, no different than all the other agencies, we could sit, HUD, Department of Agriculture, we could go through them, right? There's waste, fraud, and abuse, and we owe it to the American people, by the way, to eliminate that waste, fraud, and abuse. There's no excuse for that, okay? We owe it to them. But in the search of trying to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse doesn't mean we should get rid of an entire agency. No, we should eliminate the waste, fraud, and abuse from those agencies because all of these agencies still have important functions. Obviously, the Pentagon, we're not going to get rid of the Pentagon even though they haven't been able to pass an audit 8 years in a row. There's over $2.5 trillion, let me say that again, over $2.5 trillion missing in the Pentagon, like real money, okay? And no one's talking about getting rid of it. And so, that's the function of the problem I have. Look, in my own household budget, right? I can tell you my kids are definitely, there's tons of waste in my family budget based on what my kids like to spend, okay? There's definitely abuse going on. And based on the amount of boxes that show up at my house every day, my wife is definitely committing fraud, okay? But the point is I'm not getting rid of these people, right? What am I gonna do? I'm gonna sit them down at the kitchen table and I'm gonna say, we need to spend less, right? What are we spending on? We didn't have that conversation here with USAID. We never got to say, hey, look, these programs, delete them. These things, get rid of them, okay? Every other agency somehow is getting that benefit of the doubt, right? We're giving that benefit of the doubt to the Pentagon. I want to end with this. Now that these functions are going to move over to the State Department, all right, Mr. Kaplan, do you think the State Department has the resources, the personnel to do all of this oversight, the grant oversight, to the capacity to handle all of this without adding more personnel to the State Department?
Let me begin with this, Congressman Moskowitz. I can assure you that the same vile predators that sought to steal from USAID or divert funds to terrorist organizations or sexually abuse minors like they did in the Ebola response will try to do the same thing at state.
Yeah, and look, that's all terrible. We all support, clamping down on that and getting rid of it. My question is, do you think the State Department at this juncture needs additional resources now that they have all this additional responsibility?
Contrary to media reports, foreign assistance programs are not dead, and there are billions and billions and billions of dollars now being spent and administered by not only State Department,
my
but
time is up. I'm just trying to get an answer. So, okay, yes, I'm with you. But do you now think that now that that is all moved over to the State Department, do they need more resources to limit the fraud, waste, and abuse? Because otherwise, aren't we going to wind up in the same situation where there's going to be fraud, waste, and abuse because we're not investing in that oversight?
Maximum oversight is essential, and that's what we brought as the IG for USAID. And when you have billions going out in complex emergency environments and money spent overseas in areas controlled by terrorist organizations and any armed group, you need adequate staffing, people, good monitoring, and an effective IG to oversee and investigate any misuse of those funds.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. I will just note really quickly, though, that while comically anecdotal, unlike other agencies, foreign assistance has benefited designated terrorist organizations who have preyed on civilians and undermined U.S. national security. So that's a little bit different, and I don't throw your family into that, although I understand Amazon can be terroristic. Trust me, my son gets on my phone and looks at Amazon, and I've had packages that came without my even knowing. With that, I'm going to go ahead and recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to our witnesses for being here and for your continued work conducting oversight and ensuring federal funding is spent on foreign aid programs as Congress directed. Now, last year, President Trump and Secretary Rubio used unfounded claims of waste, fraud, and abuse as an excuse to illegally close USAID and decimate our foreign assistance programs. While their justifications may have been false, the impacts are very real. Between 500,000 and 1 million people died in 2025. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost in the name of eliminating fraud that didn't even exist. By 2030, these cuts could lead to more than 14 million deaths, including the deaths of more than 4.5 million children under 5 years old. Because of this administration, children were allowed to starve while food was left to rot at ports and in warehouses and die of treatable diseases as medicine expired on shelves. And while Secretary Rubio continues to claim that no one has died from his aid cuts, I think we all know the truth. He's continuing to endanger lives and, even worse, is causing more waste, fraud, and abuse. In February 2025, he fired the USAID Inspector General Paul Martin when he warned in February 2025 that $489 million in food assistance was at risk of spoilage or potential diversion. In July 2025, he greenlit the State Department incinerating 500 metric tons of emergency food assistance that could have fed 1.5 million children. The GAO defines waste as the use or expenditure of resources carelessly, extravagantly, or to no purpose. Spending $800 million of taxpayer funds on life-saving food aid that feeds no one, and then another $125,000 to incinerate it seems to match this very definition of waste from the GAO. So, Director Love-Grayer, in your expert opinion, would incinerating life-saving food aid and spending nearly $1 million in the process be considered waste under GAO's definition?
Paying for food that never reached its intended beneficiaries would be something that we probably would classify as waste if it could have been avoided.
And on top of that, spending money while
And spending
wasting.
money to do so, if it could have been avoided, is something that probably would meet that definition.
Check. Waste. The rapid termination of our foreign assistance programs and the firing of expert USAID staff caused many reported instances of wasted supplies and equipment. There are reports that USAID inventory and equipment were abandoned or auctioned off at a significant loss to the U.S. government due to a lack of guidance from USAID and the State Department. Before USAID was illegally closed, there was clear guidance on what to do with extra supplies. But now, over a year after the administration shuttered the USAID website, erasing that guidance, the risk of waste continues. That's why I introduced the Supplies Act, which would require the State Department to establish clear guidance on handling unused supplies to ensure that aid is not diverted, destroyed, or allowed to expire. So, Mr. Kaplan, what guidance should be established to prevent continued waste and to ensure our aid helps the people we intended to save, not waste away in warehouses or on shelves beyond the reach of those who need them?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Look, after we issued that report in February, that launched a multitude of USAID IG products. And we did look exactly at that issue about the disposition of assets, that U.S. government-funded assets in the field. We dispersed auditors to 8 countries, including Ukraine, to account for taxpayer-funded equipment. This is including IT equipment, laptops, armored vehicles. I will say this, to USAID's credit and to the USAID staff, still around, and despite having limited staff,
well, the agency shuttered, so they're not USAID staff anymore.
At the time, but to their credit, generally the assets were disposed of, sold, or donated according to plan, and that is a testament to their responsibility and the policies that were in place and that they did follow. So we gave a solid rating to USAID for managing the disposition of assets under some very extenuous circumstances.
Well, thank you, Mr. Kaplan. And it's good that they have a solid rating, but the agency is closed, shuttered illegally. And so even with guidance in place, now it would be nearly impossible for the State Department to be able to implement this guidance without expert staff. So in May 2025, the State Department's Inspector General said that the department may not have the staffing capacity to implement the foreign aid programs and now overseas. So, Mr. Kaplan, what would the State Department need to do to ensure its workforce has the capacity and capabilities to prevent waste in our foreign assistance programs?
First of all, you need two things. You need adequate people to adequately staff programs, especially in complex emergency environments. And we dinged USAID for years that USAID did not staff its awards well enough. There was one statistic for every contracting officer. There was one contracting officer for every $65 million in USAID funds spent overseas. One for 65. DOD is one for 15 million. One contracting officer for 15 million. USAID's were one for 65. Adequate staffing is essential. We saw this in the Ethiopia aid response to the crisis there. Only 6 of 16 positions were filled. 6 of 16. USAID staff on the ground were looking left and right. Where's everyone? Where are the other 10 coming in to adequately monitor and oversee these awards? They never showed up, and that placed U.S.-funded food commodities at great risk, and it has resulted in a massive food diversion scandal, also involving the UN, by the way, but massive food diversion scandal because it was not adequately staffed so that there could be a rapid response to reports of misuse of funds. So yes, adequate staffing is vital as foreign assistance moves forward.
Well, I appreciate you making that point. I thank you both for your work to root out waste, fraud, and abuse, and I'm hopeful that we see real efforts at that going forward. With that, I yield back.
Thank you so much. At this time, I'll recognize Representative Schneider for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mills, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I think it is notable that we have a imbalance on the representation here. We hear a lot about waste, fraud, and abuse from my colleagues on the other side, but evidently this hearing's not important enough for them to come and explore it. What you all do is important. And, Mr. Kaplan, you talked about $1 to $65 million. It's a matter of return, and every one of our inspector generals, every one of our people in jail, more than pay for their salaries with what they protect in investments for what we spend. And at a time where we're spending $1 billion on war in Iran a day, having that inspection capacity is important. And the money we spend on USAID development is so important for us to protect and defend American interests around the world. A couple of questions for you, Mr. Kaplan. President Trump has undermined the very oversight mechanisms that was put in place to mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse. Trump, Elon Musk, Secretary Rubio fired nearly 10,000 USAID experts overseeing billions of dollars in our foreign assistance with no plan for transitioning oversight of USAID functions to the State Department. On top of this, the State Department laid off another 1,300 state employees, including many with foreign assistance programming experience. Public reporting suggests that the process by which the State Department assumed primary responsibility for managing U.S. foreign aid programs was rushed and uncoordinated. So, Mr. Kaplan, have those staff reductions and the USAID state merger impacted the United States' ability to mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse in foreign assistance?
Look, I'll defer any questions specifically about staffing at the Department of State to the Department of State. We as USAID currently do not have access to that information. We'd like to have access so we could do our oversight work at State Department. We don't have that access, so respectfully, I would defer that question. I think in general, what I can tell you is that, yes, given the billions of dollars going to the most remote or dangerous locations, it's absolutely essential to have experts understanding the risks, the vulnerabilities to programs, understanding the implementers, not just once it's awarded, but at the pre-award stage.
To extend on that, in your view, do you think the State Department OIG has the capabilities and personnel to oversee former USAID programs or new initiatives like the $2 billion UN OCHA Memorandum of Understanding announced in December?
I can tell you that USAID has the capacity and longstanding historic experience to oversee these funds. We have been authorized 5 different times by Congress to provide oversight of additional agencies administering foreign assistance agencies. We also really appreciate the support and the confidence of Congress in the recent SFOPS 26 bill to fully fund USAID to provide continued oversight of foreign assistance dollars. We appreciate that confidence on the part of Congress and our office. I know I have several of our best law enforcement personnel sitting right behind me. We are hungry for the work. We want to do the work. We have an overseas presence, which is unique to us. We're in Ukraine, Israel, El Salvador, Thailand, South Africa. We're looking to expand to other places. We are confident we can do the work. It requires more oversight, not less.
Thank you. And let me turn to Director Love-Grayer. You're well aware, last May, Ranking Member Meeks, Congressman Jacobs requested GAO review of the financial costs and strategic consequences of the Trump administration's illegal effort to collapse USAID into the State Department and terminate thousands of state and USAID contracts, grants, and cooperative agreements. Trump's USAID closure has led to the needless deaths of thousands of people around the world and exposed the executive branch to legal actions which should cost U.S. taxpayers millions of dollars. Unfortunately, not a single Republican signed on to the letter. It seems like potential waste, fraud, and abuse by the Trump administration is something they're willing to let slide. So my question, Director Love-Grayer, is, it is our understanding that state has delayed providing critically important information in response to GAO's request for over 6 months since that letter was sent, which hinders congressional oversight, limits accountability, and reduces opportunities to improve the process. In your understanding, why has state delayed responding to these requests? And what do you need from Congress to succeed in meeting GAO's congressionally mandated reporting requirements on these issues?
Okay, good. Thank you for the question. You are correct. We have had a request out to the State Department to understand what programming they've assumed, what programming they've actually pulled over from USAID along with their current programming, what their staffing levels are. So to the questions that have been asked today about whether they have adequate staffing, we are trying to understand whether they have adequate staffing for oversight, as well as the processes they've been using to not only move those programs over, but also to oversee them in the future. And we have been delayed for almost 8 months in getting a response to those questions. It's not clear 100% why we've been delayed. We've heard part of it is the transition of staff, not sure who's supposed to be taking on certain questions that we have, but I did thankfully receive some assurance over this last Friday that there will be greater cooperation in the future. What we need from Congress is encouragement from the agencies to respond to GAO and OIG audits. Again, this is information that's critical to understanding whether they are capable or positioning themselves to effectively oversee all of this new foreign assistance. We're unable to provide that information to Congress and taxpayers in a timely way when we're waiting, up to 8 months for basic answers to questions.
Thank you, and I'll yield my time, but before I do, I ask the chair to join us in helping to get that pressure, and let's get those reports done. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Schneider. I will just have one rebuttal, which is that USAID's budget steadily increased over the years. More money did not fix USAID's systemic problems. Further, the cost of compliance can exceed the cost of delivering foreign assistance as well. And Congress has a right to fund or not fund any department, agency, and or bureau. It's not illegal for the president to eliminate anything where waste, fraud, and abuse or create anything such as DOJ.
Mr. Chairman, I have a UC request.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to submit to the record a statement from Donald Sherman, President and CEO for the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, and a statement from Asher Moss, the Executive Director of the Alliance for the American Leadership. Both statements address the disruption of oversight with the illegal dismantling of USAID and detail recommendations for the path forward, and then a letter to the committee from the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan legal organization to help strengthen and enforce campaign finance and ethics laws to prevent corruption.
It shall be entered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With this, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing. And, Mr. Kaplan, I appreciate your work as Inspector General. And, when you think about the premise, somehow it's controversial that America's resources should advance America's interests. I think, that's long overdue. So when Secretary Rubio came in and started looking at, USAID, look, we've talked about it for years. They felt they were so autonomous that they didn't even need to respond to the Secretary of State. They certainly didn't respond to Congress. They would come give us information, but they would continue on autopilot doing the things that they felt were important, regardless of what the executive branch told them, regardless of what strings were attached on ledge branch money. So I think it's long overdue for them to be shut down, and the essential things are being done. And the things that, some of my colleagues are, grieved about are, funding like millions of dollars for DEI initiatives and climate agenda things like transgender operas or transgender surgeries, and, advancing these in particular in countries where their laws found it offensive. So if you look at Guatemala, for example, they were being pressured to change their constitution because it is pro-life, it protects life. That was the priority for the administration, the Biden administration, instead of trying to say, well, how do we work together with Guatemala to do the things that are mutually important to Guatemala and the United States? And when Guatemala offered to try to help all the migration crisis that was flooding our country, the Biden administration was like, no, we're doing that on purpose. Don't get in the way here. To the point where they were actively trying to remove the prosecutor general and put leverage on the members of Guatemalan Congress to do that, all to advance, an agenda that isn't the United States agenda. It's a radical left agenda run by the Democrat Party today. So that's why my colleagues are here venting their frustrations today as we turned off their boodle bag. So you look at, Mr. Kaplan, so much of this money is essentially laundered through non-government organizations. I don't think there's a lot of irony in the word non-government organization because, of course, it's funded almost completely by the government. So can you talk about the challenges of transparency when the money goes through non-government organizations and maybe with specific application to Ukraine, for example?
Thanks for that question, especially for referencing Ukraine. We are the only IG office with full-time criminal investigators posted in Kyiv that are investigating fraud and corruption involving non-security U.S. foreign assistance to Ukraine. So very active in that space. We always have been. With NGOs, I would, again, put it the three buckets of recipients: contractors, NGOs, and United Nations. I'd put the UN at the very bottom in terms of transparency and accountability, way at the bottom, like under this table for transparency and accountability. NGOs really depends. And if it's a foreign NGO, meaning an NGO that's based in London or based in Guatemala, as opposed to an NGO, which is really just another name for an aid organization, think Mercy Corps based in Oregon, Save the Children with a DC office, Samaritan's Purse in North Carolina. There's different types of aid organizations. We had trouble with foreign NGOs. Usually they're lawyers, and they would, NGOs based in Europe, they would, again, try to hide behind European general data privacy regulations or some other thing that they seem like they'd make up on the spot as to why they couldn't share information regarding employees who corrupted, defrauded U.S. programs, or even worse, sexually assaulted beneficiaries while performing U.S. government-funded awards. We would have those fights. We would navigate those challenges. We would find solutions. I think tightening up award provisions, both with the United Nations and foreign NGOs, where transparency and access is much more limited and challenging, and recourse is much more limited too. It's much harder to subpoena an NGO based in Geneva than one based in Ohio. So that is a major challenge, access and transparency. That challenge continues, not just USAID, it's going to continue at future foreign assistance agencies.
Yeah, and I think, look, if they're not supportive, if they're not fully cooperative in transparency, why would they be eligible for another dime of aid? And in particular here, you've got NGOs and others that are in clear violation of the United States law. So if you look at the Helms Amendment, you're not supposed to be able to use U.S. money to fund abortions. Domestically, that's Hyde, and in foreign aid, it's Helms Amendment. And so, we had statements by East African faith leaders who viewed U.S. aid as, quote, missionaries of evil, because the Biden administration hijacked the aid programs to promote abortion, LGBTQ, transgenderism initiatives with U.S. dollars. So with respect to abortion, that violates our laws, and that's why I introduced the Aid Accountability Act of 2025 to permanently defund these agencies. So I think that's the question. Can we get something like that applied, and would you be able to audit?
On the abortion specifically, or access in general?
Correct. Compliance with law, abortion as an example. If that passes and becomes law, would that be easy for you to audit and apply?
Whatever compliance requirements were imposed on aid recipients by either Congress or the administering agency, and if there's a potential violation of policy, laws, rules, regulations on the books, that would be something that we absolutely would be able to audit and investigate. It would be our responsibility to do so. If a law is on the books and an organization receiving U.S. taxpayer dollars is violating that law, that absolutely would be in our remit.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you so much. This time we'll recognize Congresswoman Jacobs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I just want to reiterate my colleagues who requested that the administration cooperate with the GAO review that was requested in a bipartisan way by ranking member and myself to look at the impacts of the illegal dismantling of USAID and the foreign assistance cuts. I also want to follow on my colleague, Mr. Davidson's questions. Ms. Lovegrayer, he highlighted the difficulties in, being able to do oversight when you're giving it to, and when you're giving money to NGOs. But the Trump administration has actually taken dramatic steps to change how we're doing foreign assistance. For example, in the past, we would give NGOs money to deliver key global health assistance, including in countries known to have high levels of corruption. However, now the State Department will provide health assistance directly to those governments through government-to-government memoranda of understanding. And while government-to-government can be an appropriate tool to enable long-term sustainable transition off foreign assistance, its implementation actually requires enhanced oversight and risk mitigation techniques to prevent fraud. So in your view, what risks do such changes present? And does the State Department currently have the appropriate oversight in place to ensure accountability for that funding?
Thank you for the question. As you mentioned, there are risks to all the different types of delivery mechanisms. When we work directly with NGOs, other international organizations, depending on the type, as Adam has mentioned, we often have stipulations. We have access to their documentation. We have access to the information that they're collecting. And that access is limited when we're doing government to government. We don't have audit authority to audit another federal government. We can't require, or another country, we cannot require them to provide us with certain types of information. So the visibility into how the funds have been spent can be a little less, it can be a little less transparent. So there are risks to government. There are actions you can take to improve those risks, such as building in requirements for certain types of reporting and building that into the actual award as a stipulation for receiving the award. But we would need to see how these government-to-government awards are being structured to determine if they have the right level of oversight built into the actual award language. And in terms of whether state has the capacity to oversee them, we have in the past identified weaknesses in both state and USAID in terms of having a sufficient number of staff to conduct oversight. With the new programs that state is administering and with the fact that they have not increased their staff, this is an area that we're looking into. We want to be sure that they do have sufficient oversight.
Thank you. So it's clear that changing the way we're doing this is not actually to decrease fraud, waste, and abuse, because this is actually potentially opening it up to even more. Mr. Kaplan and Ms. Lovegrayer, since January 2025, have senior USAID leadership ever impeded GAO or the Office of the Inspector General from addressing instances of waste, fraud, and abuse in foreign assistance?
I'm sorry, I want to make sure I captured your entire question. Can you say that one more time?
Sure. Have senior USAID leadership since January of 2025 ever impeded GAO's ability to address instances of waste, fraud, and abuse in foreign assistance?
So we have requests for information to USAID, the current leadership that's left, and of course since 2025 that we have not received responses to, but we have not had any senior officials directly tell us that they were not going to cooperate. We just have a lack of responsiveness. Yeah.
Mr. Kaplan?
It's been, we have not had anyone tell us that we can't do an audit or investigation. However, it's challenging. It's sometimes very quiet at the USAID office space and trying to get access to individuals to answer our questions or produce required records has been challenging if they're no longer there.
Yeah, and what about at the USAID Legacy Unit at State or the State Department more broadly? Are they fully cooperating with GAO and OIG inquiries and investigations related to foreign assistance?
Well, our general counsel is currently collaborating with theirs to try to get past some of the concerns that USAID has raised with regard to providing information moving forward. So we are at a bit of a standstill, but we're hoping to move forward with some progress soon.
For USAID, I'd say we believe, and I think Congress just confirmed in SFOPS in the state appropriations bill, that USAID has continued oversight jurisdiction over programs under Part 1 of the Foreign Assistance Act, which is basically all humanitarian and development. We have the expertise to do so. We know the people's projects, problems, places where the fraud occurs. We are working with the Department of State to try to obtain access both operationally to State Department systems and records and personnel. It has been to date the position of state and the state IG that we, USAID, despite our expertise, should only look backwards, only look at allegations that came in pre-July 1, not post-July 1. We appreciate Congress's support. We appreciate the ongoing efforts and work with the department to get access to state records and information so we can continue to combat fraud, waste, corruption, diversion, sexual exploitation and abuse, human trafficking, so on and so forth in foreign assistance programs, because we know what we're doing.
Thank you. Well, I urge the administration to cooperate with you all. These investigations are important. We all want to address waste, fraud, and abuse, but what they're doing is actually making it harder to do so. Mr. Chairman,
Thank you so much. At this time, I'd like to recognize Ms. Madeline Dean from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I'm glad we're having this hearing. It is important to focus in on auditing, forensic auditing, identification of waste, fraud, and abuse whenever taxpayer money is involved. So I thank both of you for testifying today. Thank you for the work that you do. And Mr. Kaplan and Ms. Love-Grayer, I want to enlist your help, because what we hear in this committee and so often from the administration is misinformation, is propaganda, and sometimes downright lies, repeated so often in order to damn the work of USAID and the many, many people of USAID who have done extraordinary life-saving work. The truth is powerful. I need your help. We have heard this majority party and the administration focus on a small handful of examples about which they are not being honest. You heard it here today. $70,000 for production of a DEI musical in Ireland. Shocking. You know what the DEI of it was? Number one, it was not USAID. This was a State Department grant, not USAID. In 2022, the U.S. ambassador hosted an event featuring Grammy-winning folk duo Teresi and Giddens, along with other Irish and American musicians. Horrible. How did we ever let that happen? $47,000 for transgender opera in Colombia. How often have we heard about the transgender opera? I'm sick of it, because guess what? It wasn't USAID. They did not fund it. The White House appears to be referring to a $25,000 State Department grant that was in Bogota to stage an opera, As One it is called, composed by Laura Kaminsky. It is a well-known opera in the United States and highly acclaimed by its audiences. How about $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru? We've heard that one from the president, from this majority party. Wrong. USAID did not fund this, and it was not specifically transgender. Instead, the grant, State Department grant, provided $32,000 under the guise of public diplomacy to Peru's education department to cover expenses to produce a tailor-made comic book featuring an LGBTQ+ hero, not USAID. Let's talk about the vast, vast majority of what has been cut. Critical life-saving aid. I've purposely brought these with me. I was recently in West Africa, visiting programs impacted by the shuttering of USAID, programs helping pregnant women with vitamins. The United States pulled out of that program, life-saving vitamins for the women's nourishment as they were pregnant. programs that measure, maybe you've seen this band used. It is used around the arm of a baby. And if you see the red, they are malnourished. I can't tell you the number of arms that I saw in programs in Ghana and Togo where the children were in the red. Children the size of infants when they were actually toddlers. What did we do? We pulled out. We're not going to do that anymore because of the trans operas. Honest to God, help me with the truth. This is already costing lives. Studies have estimated that USAID's dismantling will lead to 14 million additional deaths globally. Think of the irony. Think of the hypocrisy. Think of the paradox. The Trump administration wants you and us to gut the mechanisms and staff that are essential to mitigate against waste, fraud, and abuse. And so, let me ask you one question. Speaking of waste, as my colleague said, let's repeat this horrific example. In 2025, following the president's shuttering, the United States government chose to destroy nearly 500 metric tons of emergency food assistance procured by USAID. Starving children, their families hungry too. Instead of using it to feed as many as 1.5 million hungry children that had already been purchased, $800,000 worth of food, it cost another $125,000 to incinerate it. Would anyone in this room oversee a program that would do that? Would anyone? Would you?
That certainly wouldn't be our intention, no.
Well, somebody should have stood up and stopped it. I consider that grotesque waste. I consider that a fraud on the American people, and I consider it abuse of the global health system. I don't know if, were any of my photographs available from my trip? Were they shown while I was speaking? Just to show you. In the middle is a vaccine clinic in Togo, where the village elders were encouraging the mothers, the fathers to come with their children. We helped administer vaccines, as of course we have the nonsense here in this country under Secretary of Health and Human Services. These parents were so eager to make sure their children were vaccinated against disease so that they could thrive. You can see the mothers holding their babies. You can see that baby being weighed and not nourished enough. They measure their arms, they measure their development, and they come in regularly. UNICEF is doing the middle program. US isn't helping. And these other programs, the United States dollars have been shuttered. And that's just a handful of programs. There are programs around women and girls' sexual abuse, rape, incest. What did we do? We visited one such program. Our money is gone, and so the program is far less effective. We saw a woman who was waiting for help. She had been badly beaten. We went in and visited with her. She was bloodied. And in order to get to the next doctor with no US funding in the program that had been US funded, she needed $5. She didn't have it. So guess what? The person who beat her up was called to come pick her up. That's failure of US leadership. I will argue till my dying day that we should spend more in humanitarian aid in this kind of financial assistance around the world. Dollars spent like this magnify versus dollars spent in war, $1 billion a day, taking lives. I ask for your help to please stop the majority party and the administration from putting forward these lies that are actually harming health around the world. I yield back, and I thank you for the indulgence.
My pleasure. I understand the passion that we have, and certainly it is always important for us to ensure that money gets to those who are in need. But the problem we have seen is that the increase in USAID funding hasn't led to better oversight, but more waste, fraud, and abuse, as demonstrated.
It's led to better outcomes, Chairman.
To include, Ms. Steen, the exact program that you talked about when it comes to global health funds, where there are falsified documents of over 359 unauthorized wire transfers just in the USAID-funded bank accounts. And so this is why the OIG being referred to this case, the U.S. Attorney's Office of the District of Columbia, which declined to pursue criminal prosecution, but USAID issued the former subawardee, another employee, a 5-year debarment from working. So these programs have been grossly abused, but the necessary aid and support to those in need, certainly we should find, and that's why this is about finding a pathway to ensure that we can get control of the waste, fraud, and abuse and guarantee that the money gets to those in need. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond these in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. I thank you both so much for this opportunity and look forward to working with you in the future, as well as for helping to support more transparency and no stonewalling. With that, we're adjourned.